Welcome everyone, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're dialing in from. I'm Professor Rebecca Ivers and I'm Head of the School of Population Health here at UNSW Sydney. I'm coming to you today from Aboriginal land, the unceded lands of the Bedegal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respect to Elders, both past and present, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. I know we have people joining us from around the globe today, and I pay my respects to all First Nations people joining us. We're here today to talk global health and specifically about how we decolonise global health. And I know you've joined not to hear from me, but from an incredible panel who I'm going to introduce shortly. But before we start, I wanted to say a few words about why we're having this discussion and why indeed now. Our school, newly renamed as the School of Population Health, is a large and vibrant school with over 1,000 postgraduate students and 200 candidates undertaking research degrees, mainly PhDs. We work with policymakers, international agencies and community organisations worldwide to address the key health challenges facing the globe, including emerging threats such as COVID-19 and climate change, addressing health systems challenges to ensure equitable and efficient delivery of healthcare. Our alumni are spread across the world, including Australia and many other countries across Asia, Africa and the Americas. Our key degrees are in public health, both postgraduate with a Master of Public Health and an undergraduate degree, the Bachelor of International Public Health, the Master of Infectious Disease Intelligence, which has been critical in these times of COVID and training up the workforce of the future, the Master's degree in Health Leadership and Management, and we teach public health content into the undergraduate medical degree here at UNSW. I'm really proud to say that our latest degree is the Master of Global Health, which is transitioning from our existing Master of International Public Health. We'll be offering the Master of Global Health for the first time under this new moniker in 2021. The name change came as a result of some soul searching we did as a school as we developed our new school strategy over the last year, where we reflected on who we are, how we teach, and how we conduct research. We asked questions of ourselves, such as what is global health and how is it different from international public health? We wanted to change our degree name to signal our intention to ensure our research and education focuses on addressing health issues and global forces that transcend national boundaries and governments and focus on reducing inequities in line with Ilona Kickbush's definition of global health, moving away from a more north-south development-focused approach to health, research and teaching. Of course, as soon as we start doing that, that then sparks other conversations about what curricula we teach, who teaches it and from what perspective, and questions how we engage in research and with whom. As part of this process, we're challenging ourselves to recognise our own biases and perspectives, to feel discomfort and to learn from the important lessons that come from such reflexivity. This in turn leads us to questions about colonisation of global health and then its decolonisation. And so again, we question, what does this mean and how do we do it? And this brings us to today. This panel is therefore the manifestation of all of this collective soul searching that we've been doing. And we wanted to start a conversation about decolonisation of global health that will continue as we bring our new degree and as we enact and implement our new school strategy. To aid us in the journey and to work with us in the journey, we firstly challenged our students to tell us what decolonising global health means to them. And they've made some videos talking about this, which are truly inspiring and reflective of the talent from our students. Look, I'm going to show you some of their work later on through the panel discussion and award some prizes to them. So today, I'm proud to launch our Master of Global Health and look forward to learning from and being challenged by our students as we go forward. I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our conveners of the program, Drs. Augustine Asante, one of our panellists today, and Dr. Patrick Rawsthorne, and both have been instrumental in refining our curricula and doing some big picture thinking about how we go forward. With our other staff, Professor Richard Taylor, Heather Worth, Christine Linhart and Blessing Okombi. And I do also want to say a big thank you before we get underway to the supporting team for this event, our Communications Committee, Ramesh Walpola, Nandita Baraya, Christine Rousselis, Grace Race, Sebastian Parisi, and our school manager, Anil Prakash Singh and Ravit Danieli Vlander. So that's all the thank yous underway. I'm delighted to be joined by this panel. We want to have some hard conversations. I acknowledge that the first hard conversation I need to have, and I've had to have, is to question whether I should even be here to chair the panel as a white, middle-class, highly educated woman. These are questions as leaders we must ask ourselves when to give up power and voice. But today I've remained here and I'd like now to get proceedings underway. We're going to have the panel discussion. We will be having questions from the audience, so I'd encourage you to put them up as we go and we'll try and get to them through the panel and towards the end. So to introduce our panel, today we have with us Dr. Seye Abimbola. He's Editor-in-Chief of BMJ Global Health and a Senior Lecturer at the University of Sydney with an honorary appointment at the George Institute for Global Health. He's a health systems researcher. He's worked as a healthcare practitioner in Nigeria after completing his medical training there. And he also has a PhD in health systems research from the University of Sydney and University of Oxford. Seye is incredibly talented. In 2007, he was awarded the British Medical Journal's Clegg Scholarship and won the Joint Lancet and Global Forum for Health Research Essay Prize for Young Voices in Research for Health. And I'm sure you've seen him very much on Twitter and in his role as the Editor-in-Chief of BMJ Global Health. So welcome, Seye. We're really delighted to have you here. We also have Augustine Asante. We call him Kojo, otherwise known as Kojo. He's a health economist with 15 years experience researching in the areas of health financing, equity and health systems in low and middle income countries, and he's worked extensively in the Asia Pacific region, sub-Saharan African countries. He's also worked as a consultant health economist for the World Bank and consulted on health systems issues for a number of multilateral and bilateral agencies, including WHO and DFAT here in Australia. He is, I'm proud to say, the director of our Master of Global Health program here in the school and co-lead of our Global Health research stream. Welcome, Kojo.
Thank you.
Next, we have Associate Professor Faye McMillan, and she's a Wiradjuri woman from Trangie, New South Wales. She works at Charles Sturt University as the director of the Jawarang program, the Bachelor of Health Science in mental health, a program dedicated solely to the education of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for the mental health workforce. Faye was a 2019 New South Wales Aboriginal Woman of the Year, and she's Senior Atlantic Fellow for Social Equity and a founding member of Indigenous Allied Health Australia. Faye is an a strong leader in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health space, who really is someone that, I look up to very much in terms of the lessons that we can learn from her and the knowledges that she brings. Welcome, Faye.
Thank you.
We also have, and I'm afraid to say that Lynn Morgain, who was coming to us from Oxfam, Australia, is unable to join us. She's had a medical emergency and she's had to step away, but we're very fortunate to have Anthea Spinks step in her place. Anthea is the Program Director for Oxfam Australia, and she oversees the units within Oxfam that implement international programs across 25 countries, as well as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programming implemented alongside partners in Australia. She too has many years of experience, 20 years of experience working in international programs with a focus on humanitarian and conflict-affected contexts. Prior to her current role, Anthea worked for World Vision for over 10 years, and she's covered emergencies in Nepal, Haiti, South Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Myanmar, and other African countries. Welcome, Anthea, and thank you so much for stepping in at such short notice. We really appreciate it. It's great to have an NGO voice here. And finally, but certainly not least, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Sabina Faiz Rashid. She's Professor and Dean of BRAC James P. Grant School of Public Health at BRAC University in Dhaka in Bangladesh. Sabina played a key role founding and growing the International Master of Public Health program at the school in 2005, which up until now has got 450 alumni from 27 countries. Her interests lie in critically examining public health approaches and how social, cultural and political economic factors influence choices, decisions, behaviour and the resulting impact on the health of the poorest and most disadvantaged communities. Welcome, Sabina. It's wonderful to have you here, and thanks everyone for joining us. Now, after all of that, I'm going to hand over to our panel to speak. So let's go to you first, Kojo. I'm going to first ask each of you to talk to us about what does decolonising global health mean to you. So over to you, Kojo.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I've been thinking a lot about this, and I don't think we can have a meaningful debate about decolonization of global health without first reminding ourselves what colonization or colonialism is. So that is the angle I want us to start. And I want to start by saying that colonization is a form of domination. It is about power. It is about control. It is the exercise of control by one group of people over the territory and behavior of another group. It is about one group of people telling the other, you aren't civilized enough. And you're going to bring our civilization to you, whether you like it or not. It is also a form of exploitation, both of the mind and of the resources of the colonized group. So that is what colonization is. Now let's bring it home to the global health space. What does decolonization of global health mean? To me, it is very simple. It is about reversing the domination and control over the policy and practice of global health by the global north. It is about democratizing the processes of knowledge generation and sharing in the field of global health and bringing to an end this neo-colonial attitude of the global north about whose opinion should matter in our common search for solutions to the challenging health issues that confront all of us as a global community. That, to me, is what decolonization of global health is about. Thank you.
Thank you, Kojo. Sabina, let's come to you. What does decolonisation of global health mean to you? And you're muted.
I always self-mute. Yeah, so thank you very much. I just want to take it at a micro level. So if we look at the different structures and levels of power, control, domination, how does that happen in research? I'm not going to talk about curriculum. So when we say we do research on populations, disadvantaged communities, are we doing research with communities? Or are we doing research on communities? Are they subjects that we study? Do we actually engage with them? Do we develop co-design tools? Do we involve them in the stakeholder discussions when we actually have our dissemination and findings? Because research grants are all about communities. It's the name of poverty and development that brings in grants. So I want to go to another fundamental question about what is the ethos of the research we do, irrespective of discipline. Of course, you can have the other complicated discussion of what kind of disciplines are prioritized in public health. But I want to go to a more fundamental question of within even our country in Bangladesh as researchers. I'm not even talking about parachute researchers. I'm talking about within country researchers who then, how much do they actually look at communities as objects of study or actually learn and understand from the very communities that our ethos is to help or serve or learn from and improve health outcomes. And I think we've moved away from that. So I see these kinds of, colonization, decolonization of global health play itself out in many different ways because it goes back to the earlier speaker's point about who controls knowledge, who's considered the knowledge bearer, who's considered the target, the beneficiary, that we are informing, the saviors. So there's many different kinds of saviors operating in this field as researchers, as people working in development. And it's not, and yes, of course, there are challenges with the North and the way funding is structured, the way you have structured, the way we have structured understanding of ethics. But even within the South, sitting in Bangladesh, there's a fair share of us doing a lot of that kind of global health research, where the communities are invisible, but are actually become the extraction of data to inform our publications, but we don't actually go back, nor do we start with them at the center of our research. So that's how I'm going to speak to it. Thank you.
Faye, let's come to an Australian context.
Thank you. Look, like Kojo, I've sat and contemplated this for quite a while, and the colonial project comes to mind as to how do we have a conversation about decolonisation. And Rebecca, you pointed out that as a white privileged woman, is this even the right conversation to have? And it's the experience of colonisation by First Nations, by people who've experienced slavery, by people who've experienced immigration or migration that they have no control over. And it's, where do we hear the power? Where is the power balance coming from, and where is the voices that are being heard? And Sabina spoke to that, and even whipping around the panel, we're all prefaced by titles that allow us a sense of privilege. And yes, we might have come from disadvantaged backgrounds. on the start of that journey, but it is, where is that voice of community? Where is that being heard, and who is taking note? And, so that was the very, academic way. But the other part was, there are multiple truths in any conversation. And if we don't listen for the fact that they are truths to the person speaking them, then we will always go for ego over eco, and we won't truly be able to engage in decolonising, because it will always be seated in the seat of privilege as opposed to in the position of knowledge, and where is that knowledge and truth coming from.
Thank you, Faye. Now we come to you, Seye. What's your perspective? I know you've thought very much about this question, and I'd be really interested to hear your perspective.
Yeah, it's a very big question, I think. I think decolonization is perhaps too big for global health. It's such a huge thing that to even think about it in the context of global health, so you have to stretch your mind a little bit. But at the same time, I also feel that there's a lot of issues that global health has to address that go beyond decolonization in the way it works. So in a sense, it's too big for it. In another sense, it's small among, not small, but it's just one part among several other things that global health needs to address. And for me, where those two issues intersect is where I put supremacy. And I love, there's a very interesting interview of the singer, musician Nina Simone, African-American, in 1970, where she was asked, what does freedom mean to you? And she said, no fear, no fear. And if you know Nina Simone, she's a very fierce woman. So say no fear repeatedly, you could feel the emotion. And for me, it's no supremacy. When you say, what does decolonization mean for me in global health? It's no supremacy. And there are different forms of supremacy. And in many instances, you don't even see them very clearly for what they are. So there's the racial one, which we know a lot about, and it's often black and white, so we can see that. There's also the gender one. And as Sabina mentioned, that there are kinds of supremacy that you see within countries. So the urban-rural supremacy exists, the ethnicity one, the religion one. And when you also move into the space of knowledge production, you also think about how we think of the global as supreme to the local. So we love things that are global, and we sort of look at things that are local as small and marginal and peripheral. And there's also the north-south supremacy axis. And there's also the one that Faye very brilliantly mentioned, which is the one about settlers and indigenous. So there are all these axes of supremacy. And there are more than that. But for me, to decolonize global health is to surface these axes of supremacy and to undo them one after the other. And it's a huge project. It's going to take us forever to do that. But we have to keep doing it, and we have to start now.
But the first step is also to recognise it, I think, as well, and recognise it and speak to it. Anthea, cutting to Oxfam, what's your perspective when you think about decolonising global health from an NGO perspective, from, you're running programs all over the world?
Thanks, Rebecca. And before I answer the question, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on, which is the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm coming to you from Melbourne, so just wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging from my traditional lands. It's a really, really important question, Rebecca, that I think the whole aid sector, so when I'm talking about it with a lot of my colleagues, it's about decolonising the entire sector, and the global health conversation is really critical to that. And I think it speaks to all the things that my fellow panellists have said, because it is essentially about power. Who has power, who sets the agenda, who's making decisions, how are resources allocated, how are voices heard or not heard. And so I think from an Oxfam perspective, it's a really, really important conversation that we are grappling with as a part of that. So we are, part of that colonial system. As an individual, you read out places that I've worked in. So I was an individual in those places that was part of that colonial system. So what does that mean for really asking really critical but sometimes uncomfortable questions of ourselves as individuals, but also uncomfortable questions of ourselves as an organisation and ourselves as a player in what is a very complex, overly constructed system sometimes that actually perpetuates these power imbalances perpetuate issues of lack of voice. So I'm really pleased that this conversation is taking place. I'm really pleased that the conversation is starting to emerge in the broader sector, but it is by no means a concluded or complete conversation, but because it really does speak to questions around power. And I think, Sabina, you mentioned the question of research. To me, it is absolutely critical in terms of who are the knowledge bearers, how does that knowledge get recognised and celebrated and not extracted and manipulated? And that, to me, I think is a critical part of the processes we have to go through if we truly want to decolonise ourselves as individuals, as organisations and as players in this global sector.
Thanks, Anthea. I look at, and I think we know, like, and if you look at recent reports that look at global health, it shows us very clearly that a very high proportion, 85% of global organisations active in health are headquartered in Europe and North America. Most of the decision makers for high-income countries, most of them have a degree from rich countries. 92% of the leaders have a degree from high-income countries. So we need to, when we start thinking about, say, our new Masters of Global Health, we need to understand what differentiates global health from earlier approaches, whether there is anything. But where equity fits into the definition, we've heard from all of you about the layers of privilege, layers of supremacy, not just across countries and globally, but within countries and within all the different layers that we use to actually identify power and supremacy. The question is also then, how do we share that understanding with our students? How do we engage? How do we attack this in our research? So let's come to some questions. Sabina, coming to you, you're really well established within the Global Health Network, and so I'm interested in seeing how you view the terms of engagement between the global North and South, and wondering whether you can talk about what you consider as successful examples of global health partnerships that value knowledge and learning in the South, or even global health partnerships that value knowledge systems from people who are not privileged in southern settings.
Unmute. Note to self on these Zoom meetings. Very quickly, I just want to throw a few points and then I'll give you some examples. So, I've always grappled with the term global health, because within those assumptions is what is global and then what is local. So in many of the partnerships I've seen over the years, and I'm currently in a few that are very successful and currently in a few that we're pushing back. And when you're vocal, you're seen as a problem, because not everyone is vocal, right? Not everyone raises issues that are seen as normal and natural because it's so considered as part of the partnership. So I think some of the things that reminds me of the ethos of equitable partnerships are, and I'm actually currently in one, but I've worked with these colleagues for 15 years, is it's meaningful. There's a conversation from start to finish in terms of research, priority setting, context setting. It's not like we have the ideas, we're building your capacity. Now you just cut and paste those questions because we are a leading XYZ institute. So it's sort of discussions and recognizing context matter and there's diversity. Recognizing the capacity building is not just north to south, but there's a lot of learning from the south to the north and south to south. Recognizing data ownership should be owned by the institutions in the country and not we are data feeders into someone else, and cross-country papers are led primarily by certain individuals. I mean, that can be wherever you've been co-opted. I could be co-opted somewhere else and reproduce these structures. So I want to put that on the table as well. Also, I think, BMJ is here, so I want to thank them because, we had a couple of papers published because they waived the fees. If you sit in Bangladesh with our local salaries and our local wages, it's about almost £2,500 to get a paper published. Now, my younger career researchers will never get promoted if they don't have publications. We don't have money like that. We raise our own grants. We raise our own funding. So things like that, I think, are very important for meaningful partnerships. Most funding bodies are set up to ask you to bring in a certain partner from that funding institution. So the assumptions from the beginning, whether it's intentional or unintentional, is they're the lead, they're the thinkers, they're the knowledge bearers. We will all have our capacity built. I think we move beyond that. I work with many, many colleagues. I've had conversations with you, Rebecca. So I mean, just you in the UK and in Australia, in the States. where this thinking has actually been far more diluted. There's new voices, there's new thinking. The problem is some of the systems are still entrenched in terms of a sort of an approach. So I have met younger colleagues who have, they're fresh graduate PhDs from Bangladesh who've come back to Bangladesh, think they know everything. I've met young researchers who from overseas who come for 2 weeks and they become experts on Bangladesh. So there's a continual frustration about, you know, where is the critical self-reflection about what we mean by partnerships? What do we mean by the ethos of partnerships? And is that from A to Z? And I think it's going to evolve. And I think it needs to evolve. And I think critical discussions like that in one of the partnerships I'm in, they've had some real soul searching, saying authorship, data ownership, leads by mid-level. How do we create spaces for conversations? And I think it has to start with also all of us having those conversations. We can not have those conversations or challenge it. I am in a position where, yes, I'm privileged. I'm a dean of a school of public health, but I also can co-opt and become an author of a bunch of papers and make sure all my mid-level colleagues become data collectors and have their capacity built. So I think it's a certain kind of onus and responsibility and accountability at every level, because we have structures
Absolutely.
that don't allow us to move. Yeah. So that's sort of my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm sure Seye will have something to say to that, but I'm going to come to Anthea first and talk about the development sector. You know, when we look at collaborations between organisations, between global north and south, and think about the way in which they're structured, think about field work, you know, capacity development and project management and evaluation systems based on Western frameworks, does that undermine meaningful partnerships, the way in which you do business?
It's a fascinating question, because I've also had the privilege this week of attending some of the ACFID, which is the peak body for Australian NGOs and their conference. And a lot of these questions were really, we reflected them back to ourselves as a sector as well. And this question, I think, about project management, reporting, evaluation frameworks is actually at the nub of it, because yes, they do perpetuate that. You know, we've got teams in Australia that are responsible for making sure we've got reports up to standard of the donor. And that's not to say that the quality of the information is not already at standard. It's the process of making them appropriate for whoever that donor might be. Welcome to my little one, everybody. He's just come in to join me. And I think it's a really significant role that we as the sector actually have to play, to have those conversations, not just with ourselves, but with the systems that actually fund us, because those structures and those frameworks do actually contribute to perpetuating the problem. We need to be accountable. We need to be able to demonstrate impact. We need to be able to demonstrate quality. But there are ways and means of doing that I think the sector should be moving on from, because it also, I think, speaks to another concept that is a word that I actually don't really like, but the sector talks a lot about localization. I think that in and of itself is a colonial term. I don't think that's what we mean it to be. I think it's actually it's used probably because it's a nice simple term to describe the philosophy that we want to be seeing, which is around these issues of transferring power, of transferring resources, transferring decision, and making sure that local civil society and local actors are actually at the forefront of everything that we do. But it's become a term that kind of covers and catches everything. And we use it because it's an easy term and we all understand what we mean, and we understand it to mean really, really positive things. But I think actually at the heart of it, in and of itself, have we actually just created that term for our own comfort, as opposed to created that term for all the right reasons that we want, which is actually to address some of the issues we spoke about in the first question, which is how do we really get to the heart of decolonising ourselves and our sector. So there's a lot of soul searching going on in the not-for-profit and the aid sector, and I think quite rightly so.
Thanks, and really wonderful multitasking there. Your concentration ability is fantastic. Look, and I think it's really important, and I think we do sometimes, we get these terms, and I think even when we talk about decolonising global health, is this just some sort of manifestation of our own guilt and saying, well, we want to actually do something, and this is the next new fad that we think we're going to do to actually break down power? I really do think we do need to think hard about, this conversation about power and how we break that down if we're going to do something about it rather than just weasel words, I guess. So, Faye, when we come to you, we talk about global health in an international context, but these biases often persist within countries too, where we other communities en masse. We claim superior knowledge over traditional Indigenous systems. From your perspective, how do you see this playing out in Australia? How do we, what's the next steps? What's the context?
Well, I think, Anthea just spoke to, a slogan that we hear, which is, think global and act local. And it goes to that. And I think in Australia, the experience of the colonial experience by First Nations people of this country is set as it's homogenous and every nation has felt the same experience of colonisation, and therefore we can do the same thing to try and reverse the impact of colonisation. And it's a struggle and a challenge because whilst there are similarities and we don't want to other, there are uniquenesses that create opportunities to talk about where do the voices become heard and in what spaces. And so we've heard from each other around, this is still a very hierarchical system. You have grants and you have opportunities to write to those, but unless you've got the catchphrase of the day and, we've got diversity and we have equity represented in all of these applications that we put forward, then we should be held in good stead. We're likely to get some money and then we'll go off and do our research. And it goes to, data sovereignty, it goes to Indigenous intellectual property and all of these things. And I think, for many of us that come from being an object of that colonial project and the generations of that object of colonial project, then we need to recognise why many of us have gone through a Western system to gain knowledge and education of a Western system so that we can speak our truth and be heard and use language in a way that's acceptable to the colonial. But we then have to translate that back to be accepted for our communities. And that's a big ask. And, it's a huge push, and we celebrate the fact that we have so many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or people from diversity. But what are we doing? And we talked about research with as opposed to research on, whilst there's changes, and there are people who are coming through that are going, okay, I'm acknowledging that I have opportunities to bring others with me. As Sabina has said, in part of my conversations with others about this today, it's this whole notion of if I provide opportunities for others to come on journeys, what will I lose? And the answer is often nothing. But the ego gets in the way of, I've got to be first author, or I've got to be seen as the CI on that grant, or, oh, well, if I don't get money, then I'm not coming on board. And this comes back to, where is our, community-spirited leadership? How is that being recognised in grants, particularly in academic institutions where you might go, okay, I'm happy to come on. Yep, money's tight, so no, I'm not going to take anything, but you can transfer that money to community. There is somebody there that's going to be able to use that to do community capacity. So I think when I talk about it from an Indigenous Australian perspective, it is in that notion of, I can only speak to my truth and my experiences, and I don't speak to others, but I acknowledge that there are others, and I allow space for that to be heard. And I think if you look at even in today, and for our international guests, I apologise, but you look at what's happening in Victoria with regards to ancestral lands and, direction tree, that the colonial project still supports the superiority of that to make a decision that we can chop that down. We won't divert the road from where we wanted it to go. We're going to go over that, but yet we will, protect a colonial project in the shape of a statue and go, let's not do anything to that, let's not. So there is still very much difficult paradigms, and even in, you know, Australia as a country, the notion of diversity is still very hard for people to understand, because we are still very much trying to deal with our own individual circumstances, and lifting above those can often be complex.
Thanks. And really the notion of valuing others' value systems and learnings and, you know, knowledges, I think is also something that we struggle with. Seye, we might just cut to you. We're going to start talking about funding and how we use funding to control, and, you know, it's an instrument to exercise international control and local control. But let's come back to the question about publications, because we've been talking about that, and about, you know, publication, we've talked about, you know, the cost. We've heard that from Sabina about the cost of publication. But I mean, I think authorship is something that you've spoken about frequently, and it is really important about the role of authorship. And you know, if we're going to decolonize global health in a research setting, what are we going to do about authorship on journal publications? What are your views on that?
My views on authorship are huge, but I think the place to begin is first by how we think about knowledge. Because if we interpret our role, what we are trying to do when we do global health research, as producing knowledge, and then we have to sort of begin that conversation by saying who has knowledge, who is contributing that knowledge, to whom is it being communicated, on which platforms. And for me, when you think about the uses of knowledge in global, I want to begin by privileging the local use of knowledge. In other words, to think of knowledge as something you use to connect a system better with itself, so that it can actually improve, be reformed, deliver health services that deliver equity. Now, if we begin by thinking of knowledge in those terms, then the platforms on which we share those knowledge must begin by prioritizing the systems that the knowledge needs to feed into first. So now here's what I mean. So if you conduct a study, for example, in an indigenous community somewhere in Australia, or you conduct a study in a rural community in Bangladesh, for me, the first question to ask that researcher is, how has that knowledge fed back into the places where you collected? Right? Because if you've collected those knowledges and data and you publish it in the Lancet, that act in itself is extractive. Right? So I want to begin that conversation around publication from the extractiveness of the status quo. The way we think about publication today is deeply, deeply extractive. So that's one side of it. The side of who then puts their name onto publications. And I'm about to say something that could be a bit controversial, but when you think about the ways in which the international community of medical journal editors define who can be an author, the formulation itself, if you think about it carefully, is colonial, right? So when you ask yourself, who should be an author, the person should have contributed to data collection, should have contributed to analysis, should have contributed to some third thing that I can't remember now. Now, you can imagine the role of a person, for example, who sits in a community, who opens the gate to the researcher to collect data in the community, who stewards that whole process, who tells you what to think about and what not to think about, who does everything. That person perhaps is the most important person in a paper. But by the rules of who becomes an author, the person is automatically excluded. Now, I'm saying this because it's just one example of the kinds of structures that we need to start to directly engage with. Right? There are structural problems behind the curtain. And if we don't begin to talk about very, very, very clinically the ways in which we need to change who is an author, who gets recognized in authorship, then we can't fix this other problem. The other structural problem we need to address is also how universities and funders recognize who contributes to a paper, right? And also what roles are recognized. So, for example, if I am an academic who goes into Nigeria to study, and I spend almost all my energy supporting people and breeding, many academics who will be first author on the papers and etc. I don't get what I need to get to get promotion to become a professor at the university. So that in itself is another major structural problems. And if we are again not attacking those directly, we can't solve the problem of authorship. So we can complain about authorship forever, but there are problems in the background, and if we don't sort of highlight them, leave them out one after the other, and undo them, we won't succeed. Now, academics like to tell other people what to do. Every paper has a recommendation segment. ABC do this, ABC do that. Often we are not doing that ourselves, right? So in many instances, we know that there are problems, like the ones I've just highlighted, that make us do bad things. But we submit repeatedly to those structures, and we pretend as if those structures are not themselves colonial or evil. So I think that there's also the soul searching that we need to do, to say, what are the things that make us do bad things, right? And how should we begin to undo them one after the other, identify them, unscrew them? Otherwise, we will just keep perpetuating this system that keeps us being colonial without that.
Absolutely. And we've got a great comment from the audience, and I'll read it out. As a young researcher just entering the field, knowledge is still held by powerful colonial systems. To be able to make a difference, it often feels like we need to be able to code switch and play into these systems just to gain membership, to be in a position to uplift marginalised voices. And I think that's right. I mean, I think that's very much the experience. And again, it's just how do we shift the system? But I do think we see some change now, say in the National Health and Medical Research Council, when they're funding grants, recognising impact, recognising other outputs. But I still don't. I think, really, if you want to get, having Lancet publications or, BMJ Global Health first author, that ticks a lot of boxes. But we all play into it, and it's actually also about, can we all walk away from the system to sort of break it down? So and actually, it has to be, it can't be dramatic. Sabina.
I wanted to go back to a more fundamental question. We value publications, which means we value academics and researchers and careers. That's one point. But we're talking about the ethos of research, and communities need to be the center, the drivers, the decision makers around design engagement. So we have a system that's kind of upside down in academia. So we're kind of in our ivory towers, some less, some more. Secondly, we have systems where certain leaders of global are individuals that are perpetually asked to lead papers, who then bring in different authors from different parts of the world to make it seem diverse. It embeds their paper in a look, I'm inclusive, it's diverse. And all of this is unspoken, and we all understand it, including myself, the number of times I've been asked to join something because it's with the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, and there's no credibility if they don't have a Bangladeshi. I may or may not be an expert in that field. So, there's levels of, I'm complicating the discussions because I think we have a long way to go. And I think that the fact that we're having this conversation is great. Whether this will set up, and then you have data, biomedical data that's valorized. So epidemiologists, statisticians run the show for COVID. What happened to social science? What happened to context matter? What happened to social and structural determinants of health? What happened to what knowledge then drove the world to make certain kinds of, undertake certain kinds of procedures which are not applicable in a slum where people don't have space, they don't have water, they don't have hygiene, they cannot afford soap and food. So, the complicated ecosystem. Then you have certain donors who perpetuate, vaccines versus social science. So, it is a very messy space. But does that mean it can't be fixed? Whether fixed is it, or can we keep pushing back through these webinars, getting our students to think differently, introducing these discussions and curriculum, challenging academics, saying, if you haven't really worked in this field, why are you writing about with such emphasis about this? I don't think you have to live in a country, right? Emphasis. It's just self-criticism, self-critical. Me as a Bangladeshi writing about ethnic minorities, I may not be the right person. And I think even editors of journals like Lancet or other journals need to reflect. Donors, development partners that we see need to reflect. Academics themselves need to reflect. How do I get co-opted into these things? Where do I give feedback to communities, or am I celebrating? Because I just got a publication actually at BMJ. Yay! I have to actually present to the VC. So, that sort of critical reflection will help change us step by step. And I think that's important in that first conversation, because it's just too much a thing. The unequal powers and its serves and privileges many of us will continue.
Yeah, look, we've got a question from a student who's saying that what sort of questions should they be asking supervisors, public health schools, to ensure that research methodologies and approaches are just not Western? And I think it sort of comes to the nub of some of this. I think we should be supporting our students to actually challenge us, and we should be listening to them. And this is where reflexivity comes in. We should be open to be challenged, and we should be feeling discomfort when people do challenge us. And you sort of have to sit back and say, well, okay, no, all right. We do need to do things in a different way. So thank you to the students who are here. Challenge us, be open, challenge us, and we will be open to your challenges, and we'll listen. And I think that's a step as well. So I want to come now back to Anthea and start talking about funding a little bit. And I think when we talk about globalisation and development, and global health, foreign aid is often used as an instrument to exercise international control and practice soft diplomacy. We know that. We see from Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, from the UK, US aid systems and big donors, they're used to actually, they often just fund, national companies to do aid work. But can there be financial aid without a quid pro quo? And what might it actually look like? How should we do it?
Well, not a simple question, but the first part of the answer is, I think if we're truly going to have a crack at decolonising and dismantling what we have, then there can be nothing but a change to that approach as well. So that's the easy part, because we know that it's not going to happen necessarily. We know that, it is a stated aim of most international donors that foreign aid is actually part of their soft diplomacy, or it is part of their national security agenda. And so we know they say that. So I guess that's a good starting point as well, that we know that there's already a limitation or a parameter put around what that is. But I do think that there are ways that you can still, within that assumption and that parameter, get a lot better at understanding how does that aid get directed, where do we actually push, particularly as a recipient of some of those funds, where do we actually push the conversations with those donors around project design, which at its core should be designed as co-design at the very least, with communities that we're working with and alongside. And that goes, I think, to some of the points in terms of the research agenda and how does the research question even get framed? Well, how does the development question get framed, and what's the development issue that's actually being addressed through some of these programs? So even knowing that kind of higher order, government framing is there, there's still a lot that we can actually do to shake up what falls out and underneath of that system. There's a whole bunch of donors that have actually signed up to good donor principles. And so it's also about kind of reinforcing and sort of taking that from a principled level to a practical level, and kind of saying, well, if you've signed up to things under the good donor principles or under commitments at the World Humanitarian Summit, for example, get real. What does that actually now look like in terms of the changing of process and practice? But that also is a question that, again, the sector needs to ask and reflect again to ourselves in terms of the basic principles of program or project design or problem statements and creating of what is it that we're actually working on a particular piece of work for. I think it also links to, though, as well, some of the work that Oxfam in particular is doing around accountable governance, and working particularly with a lot of civil society actors around local discussions around governance at very, very local levels, around budget allocation and aid transparency, no matter where that dollar is coming from, whether or not it's coming from central treasury, whether or not it's coming from bilateral aid support, wherever it's coming from, there are opportunities there, I think, for really strong conversations around social and accountable governance. And so all of those things can still happen even in potentially the stated reality that we know exists, which foreign aid is and will continue to be, used for other parameters. And I think we know that we can challenge it, we can push it, we can try and change that. But if that's the stated position, what else are we doing to make sure that we're structurally demantling that system even within the spheres that we can control?
Absolutely. And that's a good segue to you, Kojo. When we think about, I mean, we've got a huge problem with global donor organisations. The most influential global health initiatives and networks are funded and backed by one or two donor organisations. What do you think about the role of non-state actors in this scenario? So these are donors, these are philanthropists, these are very wealthy people who are really dictating the way in which, you know, global health funding is sort of handed out and where it goes to. Has financial clout ended up handing too much power and control to the foundations and big donors in global health?
Yes, it does. And look, this is a question that I always find it a bit difficult to answer. And the reason why I find it difficult to answer is that I'm a little conflicted in this because on one hand, as a health economist working in the area of health financing in developing countries, I see the need for funding in these countries, you know, and I see the important role that the non-state sector, you know, actors, you know, what they are doing. Very, very important in filling some of the gaps left unfilled by governments in these countries. The other side of it is the influence that some of these organizations have got in the countries they are supporting. And that is why I feel conflicted most of the time when I'm confronted with these issues. Well, I know that there is an old saying that, you know, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so I'm not against donor agencies having a voice in how their funding should be used, you know, and like I said, given the amount of need over there, definitely their role is very, very important. What should not happen, in my view, is the way some external donors, I won't say all of them, some external donors, the way they become very much involved in the process of setting the health agenda in the countries they are supporting. I think that is wrong and that should not happen. And I equally think that the countries in the global south, the developing countries receiving this type of aid, also share part of the blame. Because I know there is power imbalance, but I don't also believe 100% that you should sit for somebody to tell you what to do, you know. And it's so frustrating watching what is going on in some of these countries with almost nobody pushing back. You know, there are examples of countries that have attempted pushing back and it worked. We know of what Rwandan president did when he came to power first. He pushed back, he set the parameters within which these organizations should operate. And all of them operated in that framework, in that parameter. So you can push back and get things to work the way you want it. And that is how it should be. Look, it is very obvious. If you stay back and you want them to, you know, just give you the funding without saying anything, you'll be mistaken. And I think most of these countries should, by now, after so many years, I mean, I come from my country, Ghana had independence in 1957. We are 63 years now following independence. And I started my life working with the Ministry of Finance and Economic Planning in Ghana. During that time, I saw a lot of, you know, agencies, the World Bank is there, the EU, the IL, everybody is coming to that office. All these negotiations have been going on for years. But how much has changed on the ground?
Yeah. Well,
so I keep asking myself, you know, should this thing continue the way it is going? You know, shouldn't somebody push back on this?
Well, pushing back clearly works. Seye, did you want to comment on that?
Just very quickly, I was going to make the point that decolonization, we have to remember as well that I'm speaking now as an African, that we Africans, or we colonized people, also have to decolonize our own minds. Right? That there is the locus of action is not just in the minds of the colonizers. It's also in the mind of the colonized. A friend of mine gives a very lovely example that we were taught in school in Nigeria that Mungo Park, by Nigerians, that Mungo Park discovered River Niger, right? The river that's been there forever. Some white guy came, some 150 years ago and says, I've discovered the Niger. And as we Africans, Nigerians teach it to me, Africans, that the guy discovered the river. Anyway, so the point here is that we need to also do this process in our own minds and ask ourselves, in what ways have we submitted ourselves to these supremacist ideas? And to begin to undo them very, very strategically and deliberately. Otherwise, we just keep on this cycle.
I can see all the panelists nodding here. Sabina, let's cut to you for your thoughts on this. And then there's lots of comments coming through about how we, the role of neoliberal capitalism in global health. How do we, how do we reform institutional processes to change the way non-state actors influence global health? Coming to you from a Bangladeshi perspective.
I have to say, when I teach, I do, it's so interesting you said this because it is so ingrained. The saviors, we're still the beneficiaries. We've got our understanding, our deference, our approach, our thinking. It is so embedded that when we have conversations around this, sometimes you're just seen as a troublemaker. I'll walk in, someone else will walk in. It could be, and this is nothing against anyone who's not anyone who's white. And they may have less knowledge about a particular situation in my country. But all the attention, the questions, and the understanding will be directed at that individual. Now, it may make that person uncomfortable. They may not have signed on for this. To be fair, I have family in Australia, so I don't want to paint everyone in the same brush. But, it is so embedded. It is so ingrained on how we should think. We value Western education. We value, and there's also some structural issues in our country where we've let systems go. We've also had very, very weak governance. At the same time, our mindset, we need to work on this. You were talking about students and curricula. In public health, it's a very siloed approach. Why don't we bring in the history of health? Why don't we bring in some of the, why don't we unmask what does global mean? Why don't we also have conversations around communities and heterogeneity and power relations? Our ethics, even in my school, and I'm trying to introduce this, it's not about bloody informed consent. It's about you're there to learn. You are not some educated kid who's going to then tell them how to live their lives. So I think there's many ways we can do it. And I completely agree with you. How do we undo some of this? And it starts with us. My education curriculum, I'm trying to do it. I ask them, because we have students from all over the world. You're from Sierra Leone. You tell me what you think, what the challenges are. But some of that is because, I think we need to critically reflect. And I sometimes, fall off the wagon. And I'm questioning myself because there's so many taken for granted ideas of who are the knowledge bearers. And I think it's a process that we have to do. And I think as academics, as researchers and teachers, we can start pushing back there. Why is curriculum in public health so dry? Why doesn't it include some of these aspects of public health that is at the heart of improving communities' lives, So I'm asking myself, it's not an asking all of you. I often am very, very self-critical because I just think, been in Bangladesh for 25 years, I'm a medical anthropologist. What am I doing differently? And where can I push boundaries?
And they're great questions. And if we don't challenge ourselves, we shouldn't be here. And if we're not open to learning and to thinking and being reflective and also confronting our own privilege and our own unconscious biases, we never make progress. We never move forward. I mean, one of the things, Sabina, I'm interested in hearing from you about, we know there's Indigenous groups in Bangladesh who are, have a hard time. They're, really have lots of issues. The Chittagong Hill tribe, the Indigenous people in the Chittagong Hills. How do you address that? How do you confront that yourself within the curricula that you teach? I'm really interested to hear about that.
So in our intro to public health course, and then we've got anthropology and health. We've got a couple of. I introduced the intro where they spend time in urban slums, informal settlements. We bring in two discussions with a professor in anthropology who is from the indigenous community, who goes and discusses what the structural and social inequalities look like when you are a minority, and the persecution, and getting students to critically reflect because they remain invisible, right? We wanted to do a webinar, I'll be honest, during COVID. We had to be very careful because you also have national politics and censorship of what can be shared during COVID. Look at USA, hello, perfect example of drama and messy spaces. But in general, politicians don't want to share how much COVID, what is the challenge, and then you have these minorities. But in our curriculum, what we do is we make them spend time in informal settlements. We bring in this very well-known professor, he's really smart, who speaks about land grabbing. He speaks about forcible sort of violence on these communities. He talks about what happens to them, and then he challenges students to think about, what does health mean? What are we talking about? When the fundamental rights don't exist, why is this missing in public health? And what is the voice of students? Because we can't be activists. I'm not an activist. I can write, I can speak. But he's very much wearing both hats. He's an activist for the community. So there are ways that we try and do it, because I think part of it, and sorry, I'm just going to speak a minute, is I grew up in 5 different countries. So I was always an outsider. Every 3 years, my father moved. I had to go to a new school, try and fit in. It was, Australia, Philippines, whatever. So it's not that, oh, poor me, but it's just that when you're an outsider, and then I see what's happened to the ethnic indigenous communities in our country, it's a shame. I studied Aboriginal. I studied at ANU in Canberra, so a lot of my studies were in Aboriginal culture. It's a deep shame. In Bangladesh, I'm sitting here, a Muslim minority. Our students need to engage. They need to understand, even if it's one session, that's a start. Because if you don't even have any sessions, then you're invisibilizing it, and then you're just doing blah, 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 power imbalances, blah, 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 and then, hey, all good, you've graduated. That's bullshit. Excuse my language, So, yeah.
I'm going to jump in there, Sabina, on your bullshit, because I think that's just it. When we say, okay, let's introduce and let's get people engaged in these conversations that recognise the colonial impact on Indigenous peoples, that we want it to be authentic and we need to have Indigenous voices and we have people come. But then there's trauma that gets associated with being in that space of hearing, well, oh, but I understand it to be this. And so unpacking that. And so on the one hand, we want, and on the other hand, how do we do it in a way that then ensures the next generation aren't experiencing trauma and doing so? And it's such a hard challenge, because
say something though. I don't know if your point is, I think tough for our young generation of leaders. Stuff your trauma. You need to know facts. You need to critically reflect. And as a public health student, when you graduate, it has to be informed by a certain ethos of respect, knowledge, and how knowledge is co-constructed and co-created. You deal with your damn trauma, because we're doing enough trauma to all these communities. Sorry,
that was my point, though, Sabina, that we're still traumatizing the people that are coming in to give that knowledge, to work with generations that have a different understanding of the colonial impact, that have a different understanding of what it means. And also, Kojo was talking about, we need to decolonize our own thinking. And when you start to unpack that with other people, they go, oh, so you want to go back to, you don't want to live in a house and you don't want to do all of these things. It's that colonial concept of, well, you don't get to pick and choose. And obviously, in Australia, land rights was a huge thing. And for many, it was perpetrated by, the media and scaremongering that, traditional custodians wanted to come in and take your personal house, your personal belonging, so that people feared the fact that Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people actually wanted to be in relationships with people that were on their traditional lands. They knew what dispossession meant. They knew what removal meant. They knew all of these things, and they weren't asking for that. But we were teaching that. We were telling, and we continue to do. And so that's, it's not an easy thing, and it's just how do you do it? But how do academics that want to challenge the status quo and keep a job actually push back against the academy to say, you're not upholding your responsibility in producing the next generation of critical thinkers that are exposed to all of the evidence of whatever? We are just churning out graduates that, for the majority, they're going through there. We've got some thinkers that sit on the outside that are, probably the audience here today, that are going, no, I really want to challenge and I really want to be part of this. But how? And because we talk about, security, I can tell you, I rest assured, I do not want to go back to living in poverty. That's a very real thing for people to, any job security, irrespective of what industry it's in. It's how do you continue to push back and still have security, particularly if that is the purpose you are brought in for. So, the universities look for diversity and they look for the target inclusion of ensuring that they have, an employment target number of so many. And it still creates that tension of we want to do, but we don't want to, listen when they tell us, you're not doing your job really well. You're not upholding your responsibility as a publicly funded institution to produce graduates that are going to challenge the status quo and create these conversations.
And we have seen that in New Zealand recently, I think, with some Maori researchers very much having their jobs threatened around that. I think, really important. We are going to run out of time soon, and we've got 20 minutes left. I want to come to thinking about COVID, and I think, Koja, let's come to you and think about that, and think about how colonialism has influenced the global response to COVID, and how has that exposed some of the fault lines? Has it been a good thing? I mean, has COVID given us opportunities that we might not otherwise have had of building local capacity? What's it done?
Look, I think it's playing out very clearly, and we've seen in the response and some of the comments that are being made from, I wouldn't say the majority of the people from the north, the global north, but some of them. Typical example is what the comments from the two French doctors at the beginning of this pandemic, when he sort of suggested that the vaccines they are developing should be tried on Africans first. Should be tried in Africa before it's tried in France or in any Western country. And for me, this is the sort of mentality that I always find it very difficult to accept in the global health sector. But there are only two people who said that. But what they said, as far as I'm concerned, reflects the old colonial mindset of Europeans and their cousins in North America. That is how it has been for a very long time. You're developing your vaccines, you don't know the efficacy, you don't know the safety of it, so you don't want to try it on your own people. You cannot get the authorization to do that. So where do you go? You go to Africa, or you go to another poor country. And the funny thing is that when you tried it and you find that it's working very well, you price it so much that they cannot buy. Those people cannot get access to it. That's the reality of the situation we live in.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think, that is why we all saw how difficult it was for some of the companies that are developing the COVID vaccine to recruit minorities to their study. The trust deficit is enormous when it comes to the way what we know in the past and how to trust these companies going forward. But it's a systemic issue, and it expresses very well how the Western countries and the global North thinks about the global South, and without sort of reversing some of these things, we cannot move forward finding solutions to the problems that affect all of us, because that's whole issue of global north having some sort of superior knowledge and understand the situation in your country even better than you do. It's just a fallacy. And one thing is, as an academic institution like ours, we shouldn't be perpetuating those sort of myths in our classrooms. I think we should lay it as clear as possible, allow our students, encourage them to explore the history of this subject called global health. Because as far as I'm concerned, it is not that different from international health and all the baggage that is attached to that. The name change doesn't change anything. The mentality of the people practicing it hasn't changed. And until we get down to that and highlight that. And I believe in fighting for these sort of things, because if you sit back, nobody will give it to you.
Yeah, look, it's a fad, isn't it, Kojo? We call it now global health instead of international health. We make ourselves feel better and say it's something new, we're doing something different, but nothing's changed. The structural power imbalance hasn't shifted at all. It's just that we call it a different name. Exactly. So Seye, when we come, I think it's worth talking about COVID a little bit more, because we really see that, and we don't value the gains and the knowledges and the incredible successes. Say, if we look at COVID, we're well aware of the disasters that are happening in the US and in Europe. Are we as well aware as the great successes that we see in Asia around COVID, in Vietnam, in the slums of Mumbai? What's that tell us, Seye? How do we actually value that sort of those gains? We just don't see those successes celebrated, do we?
Yes, and in answering this question, I think it's important to think about why we don't see that. And I often say that if SARS had happened in North America or in Europe, the whole world would have known everything about SARS. And perhaps they have responded better to COVID-19. And once I said that, someone said, is racism killing us? And I think it is. Our failure to learn from places that we have not traditionally thought of as being ascribed with brilliance and expertise and knowledge, I think it's killing us. It's making the world a much worse place. So there's a sense in which we need to shift our underlying assumptions about where brilliance is, about where knowledge is, and where technical support flows from. So that's one big problem. The other, and it's a role that, of course, journals can play in bringing those kinds of knowledge into the global stage. But even in thinking about that, I like to begin from the premise that Vietnam or South Korea does not owe the world that knowledge. We, in a sense, when I say we, I mean the global we, have to reach out to them to learn from them, right? It is not, and a tendency to think that unless something is known in the US or in the UK, it doesn't happen in the world, right? And that is a problem of the world, and the world has to deal with that, and it's not Vietnam or South Korea's problem. So we do need to think and rethink the platforms on which we share knowledge and how those platforms work, and who feels that they have a place and a right to share things there. So again, if COVID-19 has been so brilliant in the US, the whole academic journal publishing industry will be full of case studies of how excellent the US has been. My whole journal will be full of that, right? The fact that it isn't so for Vietnam or for New Zealand or for any other country, in fact, shows the extent to which the supremacist undertones keep sort of appearing and popping up in the ways in which our knowledge infrastructure works. And just to make one additional point, ultimately, we need to think of the way we share knowledge in terms of an ecosystem, right? That, for example, there are knowledge platforms in different parts of the world, in different communities. One of the role of institutions of academic learning and also of journals is to try and bring them together and ensure that they move across places. Not so much to locate those kinds of sharing in just a few places, but to ensure that it's wide and it's broad and it reaches everywhere. Because the worst statement I see in academic papers is, we don't know. But the truth is that many people know, right? It is you or your literature or your whatever who doesn't know. And just that simple shift in perspective. There's nothing that people in a community somewhere do not know. Your job is to find out and not to declare that the world does not know when you have not looked at that.
Yeah. Sabina, I know you want to speak, but what I'd like to do now is just cut to the video and show the student videos. And then I'm going to come back after the student videos, and each of you, I want to ask each of you to speak from your own perspective and share that might be from the journal perspective, Anthea from the NGO, to just talk about what you think are the critical things that we need to do. What are the next steps from your perspective? What are the next steps that we need to do for decolonisation? So we're going to cut to the videos now. These are the 4 winning entries, and I'm pleased to say the students are Myron Gidino, Rabina Islam, Samuel Harley, and Alex Ankama. They've made some brilliant videos, so we're going to show them now. It's only 3 minutes, so please don't check out, and then we'll come back to the panelists and wrap up this discussion. So we'll hand over to the videos now.
Colonizing global health begins by decolonizing the discourse around it. That's why I've been chairing Model World Health Organization simulations in the Global South since 2014. These offer a platform to debate global health issues in the style of the World Health Assembly. Learning from simulations in India, Malaysia, and Sudan, 3 lessons come to mind. Firstly, decolonizing global health means decentralization by engaging local communities in health policy discussions. Instead of the WHO, simulations of regional or national diplomatic bodies can generate more locally relevant policy insights. Secondly, decolonizing global health means democratizing participation through digitalization. Physical distancing due to COVID-19 has moved policy debates online, making it easier than ever before for people from the Global South to participate. In summary, decolonizing global health discourse means decentralization and democratization enabled by digitalization. Thank you.
To me, decolonizing global health is repoliticizing the way global health is governed so that the discussed becomes one with the speaker. The research subject becomes the research partner. The decided about becomes the decision maker. But it is not about inclusiveness only in the processes of governance. For the reincarnation of global health to occur, we have to relearn the language in which global health is spoken in, so that it is no longer about protecting the colonizers from the diseased, and go even deeper and rehumanize the notion of being human, where the man and the other that he colonized are in no ways superior to one another.
To decolonize global health, we must first decolonize ourselves by privileging cultural diversity. We can do this by developing genuine relationships with patients in the community, immersing ourselves as clinicians in the culture in which we work, and exchanging cultural knowledge and clinical expertise between patients and colleagues. As healthcare workers, we are trusted by those we care for. This trust brings us into their world. In order to decolonize global health, we must utilize and respect this trust. We must give back the power inherent in the current healthcare system, in doing so empowering our patients. Take advantage of the opportunities our profession affords us. Build meaningful relationships. Immerse yourself in the community's culture and exchange cultural knowledge, expertise and stories.
Hey, I'm Alex. The idea of decolonizing global health first recognizes the continuous existence of colonial attitudes and ideas that are deeply embedded in approaches to dealing with global health issues. Therefore, there is a pressing need to change from all these ethnocentric attitudes and beliefs into a new era of recognizing the value and relevance of every expert for a perspective and contribution, even those from the global south. A reorientation of the biased power structures unfairly exhibited by the global north into a collaborative agenda characterized by shared knowledge, resources, and practice in order to build local capacities and achieve health equity for all. It is critical that this idea of decolonizing global health transforms from social media activism into proactive measures such as strong leadership with the aim of achieving equitable partnerships, mutual respect, recognition, and equal representation in all global health efforts. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic. What a great, I mean, they're very talented, and we'll make the link available for everyone to have a look at the videos as well so you can see. So we've got 8 minutes left. I'm going to come back to each of the panel, and I know Faye has been frozen out and is trying to get back in, so we'll leave her till last. Let's start with you, Kojo. What is it that we need to do? And please keep it brief. You'll all have about a minute each. So,
okay. Look, what I think that we should teach our students, regardless of where they come from, what we truly believe to be the central issue of global health. Now, if we accept global health as being about delivery of justice and ensuring equity, then we should make that the central focus of what we teach in global health. We should encourage our students to explore the history of global health, to understand the power dynamics between the global north and the global south. And that, to me, is the best way to get our students to have a perspective of the subject that will help them wherever they are. And it is not about developing country and developed country students only. It's about all students, and they should understand what it's about.
Seye, let's go to you.
One of the words that I heard from students was decentralized or decentralization, which I love very deeply as an academic subject that I study, but also in the way that I think about global health. I think that one of the big things to focus on is that global health has a centralizing connotation, that's something that aggregates to the center and that center controls things and center is powerful. But in the way that I think about global health, it's an extremely decentralized thing. And it's important for students and for academics to understand that it is a very decentralized thing, whether in the way we generate knowledge and use it, right? The whole process, in the way in which we intervene and support and help and ally and enable systems, it is extremely decentralized. Now, there are certain functions that are central, WHO, Gates Foundation, etc., which should, of course, be central. But at the same time, even how those organizations work is extremely decentralized or should be, right? So it's an important lesson, I think, to teach and to be aware of, that it is decentralized and things are local, and that knowledge, the most important knowledge, trickles up from the bottom up rather than from the top down.
And Anthea, from an Oxfam NGO perspective, what's the big ticket items for you?
I think there's a few that kind of all connect, and one of them is, transformation starts with the individual. So as someone who is an individual, who is a white woman working in the sector, transformation starts with me. And what my understanding is of my role and my contribution or not to this debate and to this desire to really actually grapple with questions of power, privilege, inequality, decision, resource. So I think there's very much an ongoing conversation that individuals need to be pushing and having with each other. And then that, does extend to, it sounds a little bit cliche, but it does extend to the organisational level. And so very much from an Oxfam perspective, we are having a huge amount of internal conversations around exactly these questions, because we are a fortunate organisation that we're global. We have 10,000 staff across the world, but we are part of a colonial construct of the aid system, and what we see as an opportunity that we actually have to challenge that ourselves and to do that internally in our own conversations, and by extension to also do that externally into the wider sector. And so that's where I said before, there are some really, really important conversations happening in the sector at the moment, but they're not strong and loud enough yet, I don't think, in terms of being anything more than a conversation at a point in time around a philosophy. It will only really change when it's not a conversation that was spawned out of, particular movements. It will change when it's actually leading to organisations, individuals, and therefore the work that we're supporting being done in a very, very different way.
And Sabina, it looks like you are going to have the last word. Unfortunately, we've got some technical issues and we've lost one of our panelists. So over to you for the final comment from the panel.
Okay. Sorry to lose Faye. I just think it goes back to value of life. If we really value all life, if you look at, then we need to look at our curricula. We need to talk across institutions and say, how do we embed or integrate in our curricula more critical discussions around the history of global health, but also as individuals, as researchers? What is our research ethos? Are we bringing communities in? Are we having discussions around our lens, which is positioned by a certain kind of, subjectivity? I think we need to have those conversations, and I think it needs to be a part of every MPH. So that's one, irrespective of where you come from. Two, it goes back to, context matter. So when you are having that earlier question about deglobalization, globalization, valuing of life, why were certain countries invisible in terms of their successes and certain countries were all over the news media? Because it's fundamentally the value of life. Who dies where matters more than who dies somewhere else, right? So I really think we need to have those critical discussions because it will really, really serve us as academics. It'll serve students when they go out there to become activists, researchers, policymakers, and even when they look at public health, not so siloed or bounded. We're talking about human beings. And if we go back to the earlier panel, if we look at it from a social justice, human rights perspective of what does public health mean to us, then our curriculum and research needs to be completely overhauled, or at least not completely, sorry, I'm exaggerating because I can't do that, but have these dimensions. At least start with that process. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sabina. And it looks like we have Faye McMillan back. So Faye, last word over to you. Maybe. We'll just wait for Faye to see if we can get her to dial in. Faye, you're muted at the moment. Look, it's been a fantastic panel discussion. Wonderful to hear from everyone, and such a diversity of views. Thanks to all of our participants and our listeners for the wonderful comments and questions. I'm sorry we haven't got to many of them, but we've had such a great discussion from the panelists. I think it's been wonderful. So thank you all for participating. It's certainly given us a huge amount of food for thought, and I think challenged us all, as academics, to think about how we structure ourselves going forward, and what we need to do. And here we have Faye. So I'm going to now hand over to Faye, who's going to give us her views. Before we go, I'd just like you to have a last, make a last comment, Faye, before we hang up. Faye, what are the big steps in global health that we need to attend to? I think we're going to have to just finish up. I don't think we can hear, Faye can hear us.
I can now.
Okay, all right, Faye, we'll give you one more chance. Would you like to say, give us a few closing remarks?
Sorry, discombobulated. Just that I think, people need to be courageous. They need to have conversations that are uncomfortable and that are difficult. We need people to stand aside when they recognise that they have privilege and accept that there are other voices and other truths that need to be heard in spaces that they aren't often heard. And we do need to challenge, but we also need to look at where there has been success. And I did note some of the comments. I look at things such as the Atlantic philanthropies, the fact that, one person gave up their complete wealth in their lifetime and gave it back to the people, invested in people rather than institutions and organisations. And hopefully those people are the right people that will put the economy of the human world at forefront rather than their egos.
Wow.
And what words to wrap up on, and I don't think anyone needs to say any more. So thank you to everyone for joining us. Really appreciate the time and the value of your contribution. Thank you all, and we will continue this journey together. Thank you.